I'd like to thank Don Barry today for coming in and sharing a story about his uncle, Robert Barry.
Thank you for having me on, and thank you for allowing me to share this story with folks. My Uncle Bob moved at the end of his life back here to Chester, but for most of his life, he spent it in Florida. And most of the pictures that I'll show you today are pictures that I was able to take on my phone when we went to pick him up to bring him here to Illinois. And he's got quite a story that I'd like to share with folks. This is a picture of him. He was a sailor, but he was a flyer. He was a radio man, airman on a privateer plane, a PB-4Y-2 plane. And their primary mission throughout the time of the war, they were in the Pacific Ocean and in the Pacific Theater. And their mission on a daily basis was to go out and search and patrol for the enemy and any ships that may be attempting to aid the enemies.
About what time frame, Don, are we talking
This
about?
was in 1944 into 1945, towards the end of World War II. These next few pictures are pictures that he had in an album that I was able to take pictures of. These are actual photos that he took with his own camera. And you see the wing engine that was on his plane. And then the plane next to that was their partner, whatever squadron was with them as well. They usually flew in pairs, sometimes as many as 5 or 6, but usually on their patrols, there would be 2 planes flying together. Now, this would have been a larger squadron of the privateer planes. And these were all taken somewhere over the Pacific during the war. This was another one that, and again, you can see, I'm not sure if that's the ocean underneath or land, but that's an aerial view of another privateer plane that he took with his own camera. This is another one, and I'm not sure what the landmass is behind there. It may have been Okinawa, because that's where they were located, their airfield. And this would have been a good picture. You can see the 2 gun turrets on top of the plane, and there was also one in the front. And then on the tail was the 4th gun. And this was their primary defense against the enemy. Okay. And that's another plane shot. You can see the guns a little bit better on this shot. And this is a book that my uncle had. It was called Genda's Blade. Now, Genda was the admiral of the Japanese, he was the Japanese admiral over all their missions in World War II. And these authors, they were Japanese men. They wrote a book about the different exploits of all the battles that the Japanese were involved in. And they wanted to make it, very truthful and very accurate. So they contacted as many of the Americans who also were engaged in those battles so that they could have both viewpoints. And one of the parts of this book concerned my uncle and his plane, which was called Hogan's Goat.
I did a little research on this book, Don, and it's a bit hard to come by now.
Yes, I'm sure it is. I don't know how long he had it, but he was very proud of that. He was very proud of that book.
For the folks who are probably wondering right now, does the Chester Library have a copy? The answer is not at this time. But
no.
Who knows? Maybe we'll be able to acquire one at some point, because obviously it's been out of publication for some time.
Yeah. And this is a page from the book, and if you'll look at the middle of this page, that's my uncle's squadron, and he is in the front row, squatted down, and he is at the far right of that photo. The men in the neckties were primarily the the pilots and co-pilots of the plane. But the thing about this squadron is that every man that was on that plane had to have the ability to do any other position on the plane in case one of them would be wounded. For instance, a pilot and the co-pilot would be wounded. Any of the other men on the plane could jump in and pilot the plane as well. My uncle's main job was a radio man, and he would have been located towards the front of the plane. And they also had a position towards the rear. And in the battle that I'll tell you about in just a second, he started out the day towards the rear of the plane, and another man was in the radio position. So let's go to the next slide. At the end of the battle, my uncle wound up in the tail gun position.
So could you want to explain that a little bit more to us, Don? Would there have only been, it's hard for me to judge about how exactly big this airplane is.
It was a big plane. It wasn't as big as a B-52 bomber, but it was pretty close. And the gun in the back was added on after the war started, and it had the ability to go up and down and from side to side. It would pivot and move. It could even fire down. It carried two twin, as all of them did, they carried two twin 50 caliber machine guns. And I'd like to share the story now. It was on May 17th, 1945, that my uncle's plane and a second one took off from the Yontan airfield on Okinawa. They were out for their routine search and destroy or search and patrol mission off the coast of Korea. Lieutenant George Fairbanks was piloting the plane that my uncle was on, called Hogan's Goat, while Lieutenant William Warren was flying their plane called the Blind Bomber. The two planes took off, and at about 1 p.m., while crossing the Korean Strait, they spotted a large 100-ton tugboat headed for the Japanese coast. The boat opened fire with anti-aircraft at the two planes. Well, a young radio man on Hogan's Goat named Robert Berry heard the vessel, and it was sending out an SOS saying that they were under attack. They were alerting the rest of the Japanese. The Blind Bomber also heard this, and they let loose with two 500-pound bombs. The first one missed its target, but the second one scored a bullseye, and it sent the vessel sending 90 degrees to starboard. The privateers left with the tug blazing and slowly sinking into the water. They continued their patrol, but then 30 minutes later, the Japanese, who had been alerted, were on the search for them. The tail gunner on Hogan's Goat spotted 10 Zeros gaining on them from behind at 10 o'clock high. The other plane, the Blind Bomber, also reported 10 Japanese Zeros coming from the west. The pilots dropped their huge bombers down to a very low altitude of just about 500 to 600 feet above the waves of the Pacific. They did this so that their 24 guns could concentrate their fire at the Japanese Zeros. The Japanese Zeros were much faster planes, and if they had the ability, they would go under the American plane and raise up and rip open the belly of the plane. And that's why they went down low, so that the Japanese Zeros could not get underneath of them. The Japanese then split their attack, and they dropped 3 phosphorus bombs that missed, but then they dropped 7 more, and each of those bombs struck the American plane wings. But the big planes were able to keep flying, and then the Japanese started their second wave as they would swoop down and attack with gunfire, either from head on or from the tail, or even from straight above the privateers. The minutes drug on slowly, and as the gunfire intensified, the privateers flew nearly wingtip to wingtip. And one Japanese Zero was hit and struck the sea in flames. But Hogan's Goat was also receiving damage as well. A 20-millimeter shell detonated inside the plane, and it wounded the radio man, Dean Johnson, who at that time was in the rear turret. It also sent shrapnel into the back of the co-pilot, Abraham Shore. This explosion also destroyed their radio equipment, and their number 2 engine was knocked out. Mm-hmm. The blind bomber was also hit, and it was about to lose its tail after a 20-millimeter shell hit their vertical stabilizer and destroyed their main spar. Their front gunner then began to exchange fire with a Zero, attempting to fly unbelievably between the 2 privateers head on. The rear gunner on Hogan's Goat, who had been wounded, was assisted by his fellow crew members, and young radio man Robert Barry took his place inside that tail gun, when suddenly a second 20-millimeter shell hit right between his legs, but it didn't explode. As the Zero took fire from the blind bomber from the front, the new tail gunner began firing twin 50 caliber guns from Hogan's Goat, and the Japanese Zero went into the sea. The Zeros finally abandoned their attack after another plane went down. The battle was nearly 2 hours in length, and an hour later, the privateers limped back and landed on Okinawa, and they had fought what was recorded as the longest air battle over the Pacific in World War II. Both planes were riddled with holes. Each one had received extreme damage, and neither plane would ever fly again. A total of 4 men were wounded, 2 on each plane, but 3 Japanese Zeros were confirmed down in the battle. The Japanese then unleashed night attacks with suicide troops on Okinawa Island, and Hogan's Goat's crew had to sleep in foxholes that they dug under their plane, and he engaged in combat using Thompson machine guns every night for 2 straight weeks. And finally, one morning, they found 47 dead Japanese soldiers surrounding their plane. Finally, the Japanese gave up their attack. 2 weeks later, it was nearly May 30th, and Robert Barry was about to turn 20 years old. And then a few other shots of other things he received. If you move on, this is a side shot of the insignia, which was on their plane. Again, it was called Hogan's Goat. And you can see the bombs on each side of the goat head. And where they came from, I'm not sure. It was their lucky insignia, though. And there's a drawing, an actual drawing that he had of the plane itself. That was a drawing of Hogan's Goat privateer plane. And this is a model that he had. It was of a Japanese Zero plane. This would have been the same kind of plane that attacked them. And you can see they had wing guns, and they were 20 caliber, but the pilot was capable of firing automatically. And that's why they were so dangerous. And they were very fast. They were the fastest plane in the air. And this is the actual piece of shrapnel of the 20-millimeter shell that hit between my uncle's legs, but did not explode.
What a souvenir, huh?
Had it exploded, I never would have got to know my uncle. This was an article that was in the local Herald Tribune paper. It was about his exploit, the story that I just told you. Part of it's a little exaggerated. It says he shot down 20 planes, but they were attacked by 20 planes, but they did shoot down 3. And at that time, my grandparents were living in Modoc, and it mentions at the very end that my uncle had graduated Chester High School, but he actually enlisted because my dad got drafted, and my uncle was living with them and finishing up his high school. He quit high school and enlisted at age 17. in the Navy. And he actually came back, when he came back home from the service, he finished his high school years last year and got his diploma after he'd already fought in the war. Now this is what I kind of felt was interesting. These were every single soldier or naval man or flyer had these on their person. They were made out of kind of a cloth type material, and they're written in different languages that would have been in the Pacific theater. And that was if you got either shot down or if you had to land on a foreign land. They may have been allies or they may have been the enemy, but their language would have been written out saying who you were and that you were affiliated with the United States. And each person would have carried one of these. And just as the Americans had these, so did the Japanese. And this was some of the renditions that the Japanese had, and they also had one with their flag. And there again, it's written in Japanese, which I'm not sure what it says, but it would identify them as part of the Japanese force. And unfortunately, as I mentioned, they were attacked by suicide troops. And this is kind of a graphic picture, and I apologize for that, but this was an actual picture that my uncle took. And this was from the attack on Okinawa when they had to hunker down in their foxholes at night.
So what exactly happened to the Japanese soldiers at this point?
They were suicide. You've heard of the kamikazes in the plane. These were like kamikazes, only they were to engage in battle on land, and they would be dropped off on Okinawa by plane, and they were there to fight, kill, and to be killed. The only mission was to kill as many as the enemy before the enemy killed them, and they were known as suicide troops.
Tragic, isn't it?
And they would do this every single night, and they would do it at nighttime so that they would have the cover of darkness.
Oh.
And this was a certificate that he had in one of his scrapbooks down there, and it was his that he had finished his course in how to fly and how to fly that big plane and be a part of it. And he also went to gunner school, and this was before he left. This was a letter that was sent to my grandparents that he had completed his air crewman gunner's course. And that, of course, came in handy for him because he was able to fire those twin 50 caliber guns and take out a Japanese plane.
That last line in the letter says, "He is a fine boy and you have a right to be proud of him."
Yeah. And imagine at that time, he was probably 17 years old when that letter was written. Maybe 18 by then. This was a letter that he received from President Harry Truman. And he also received the Distinguished Flying Cross. And the Distinguished Flying, that's the medal itself. This is awarded to anyone who is involved in acts of extreme bravery and fight in the air. And it's a rare medal. It's not given out to too many people.
Well, Don, you mentioned when we were talking earlier that when your uncle passed earlier this year, about a visitor to the cemetery. Do you want to tell that story?
Yes. When we had his funeral this year, one of the airmen, or one of the Navymen that came from the St. Louis area to present the colors to the family, he had been in the Navy for 20 some odd years. And he said he has done many of these funerals, and he's only known 2 other people. My uncle was the third person he knew that had ever received the Distinguished Flying Cross. And this was awarded to him in 2014. It's through the Federal Aviation Administration. He was a master pilot, and they have an Aviation Hall of Fame, and he was inducted in that in 2014. He was very proud of that. He flew, he had his own private plane for a long time, and he flew up until he was about 85 years old.
Did you have the opportunity to fly with him?
Oh yeah, that was one of the things growing up. You loved it when he came to visit, because he usually flew here and landed at Perryville, and you knew you were going to get to go up in an airplane with Uncle Bob. He was going to take you around. After the war was over with, he came home. He finished his high school. Then he went on to college, went to SIU, and he studied engineering. And he worked for a short time for the railroad. I believe it was the Union, probably the Missouri Pacific before it became the Union Pacific. And then in 1956, he was hired by Lockheed, and they moved him and his family to Florida. And he worked with Lockheed, and in the early days of aerospace, before the 1960s. And then he began working in support of the Navy in ballistic missile program in the mid 60s. And this is a picture he had of the Polaris missile. It was capable of being fired from a submarine, and it carried a thermonuclear warhead. It was later replaced by another missile called the Trident missile, and he worked on that as well. And he lived for a while in Florida, then also went out and worked on this in California and also in New Mexico. He also was working on some of the weapons that would have been fired from naval ships during the Gulf Wars. Some of those were things that he had worked on.
Wow, he had a impressive military service and career in general. So
yes, he did.
I'm sure he's shared many stories with you, and I really thank you, Don, for sharing those stories with us here around Memorial Day. And we just thought it would be fitting maybe if you would go ahead and read this, not only as a tribute to your uncle, but to all who served.
It is, and I've been so impressed driving through town and seeing all those great banners from one side of town to the other of the men and women of our community who sacrificed for all of us. And I know some of them didn't get to come home. And this was the words in the letter that Harry Truman shared. To you who answered the call of your country and served in its armed forces to bring about the total defeat of the enemy, I extend the heartfelt thanks of a grateful nation. As one of the nation's finest, you undertook the most severe task one can be called upon to perform. Because you demonstrated the fortitude, resourcefulness, and calm judgment necessary to carry out that task, we now look to you for leadership and example in further exalting our country in peace. Thank you to all the veterans for their service to our country.